He laughed at her, mocking her talent in front of everyone. But what happened next left him speechless and changed everything. You won't believe the shocking twist that exposed his deepest flaws. Stay tuned to see how one woman's voice shattered his world. The gala hall buzzed with the sound of clinking glasses, laughter, and soft jazz playing in the background. Under the spotlight, a well-dressed crowd of elites mingled effortlessly, their conversations echoing the polished wealth they represented. At one of the grand tables sat a businessman, his suit tailored to perfection, a man of power and privilege, untouched by the struggles of ordinary life. He was the kind of person who spoke with an air of certainty, assuming that his world was the only world that mattered. He took a sip of his drink, barely glancing at the stage as a young black woman stepped up with a microphone in hand. Her name was Tasha, and for all her talent, she had yet to find her place in this world, a world that judged her based on her skin, her background, and her lack of connections. Yet tonight, she stood before an audience that could change everything. The businessman, who had been the first to dismiss her talent, leaned back in his chair, chuckling quietly to his companion. "I give it 5 minutes," he muttered, loud enough for those around him to hear. "She's just another one of those hopefuls who think they can impress people with their singing. Let's see how this goes." Tasha had heard it all before. The sneers, the doubts, the casual dismissal of her potential. But tonight, something was different. She wasn't just singing for approval. She wasn't singing to gain a place in their world. She was singing for herself, because she had a voice that deserved to be heard. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the mic, her heart pounding in her chest. But she knew this moment, this stage, was where everything would change. Even if they didn't know it yet, they would soon realize what they had underestimated. With a deep breath, she began to sing. Tasha's story didn't start in grand concert halls or glittering gala events. It started in the small, cramped apartment in a neighborhood where dreams often went to die. The sounds of the city outside, the blaring horns, the constant rush, were all Tasha knew growing up. But inside her home, music was the only thing that offered any escape. Her mother, a woman with a powerful voice but no platform, had always dreamed of being a singer. But life hadn't been kind to her. Raised in poverty, she could never afford the luxuries that others took for granted. Instead, she worked long hours at a low-paying job, struggling to make ends meet. Music was her only solace, and she'd often sing while cleaning the house, the sound of her voice filling the small apartment. Tasha inherited that voice, the gift her mother had passed down. But it wasn't just her voice that was special, it was the passion behind it. Every note, every word she sang, carried the weight of her mother's unfulfilled dreams, her own hunger for success, and the years of disappointment she'd endured just trying to be seen. She started singing at local events, small clubs, talent shows, anywhere she could find a microphone. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough to keep her going. Yet every stage she stepped onto, she could feel the sting of people's judgment. As a young black woman trying to make it in an industry dominated by privilege and power, doors were always harder to open. The whispers and dismissive glances were constant. "You're good, but not good enough," they'd say, or "You'll never make it. This is for the ones with connections." At times, she considered giving up. The weight of societal prejudice pressed down on her shoulders like an invisible force, telling her she wasn't enough. She didn't look like the top artists in the industry. She didn't come from the right background. She didn't have the right skin tone. And no matter how much she practiced or performed, she always seemed to be overlooked, as if her talent wasn't enough to break through the invisible barriers others had built. The hardest moments came when she stood in front of the people who could change her life, the agents, the producers, the executives. She had sat in countless rooms where her voice was judged, but her appearance, her background, was always the focal point. They'd smile politely, nodding along to her audition, but she could see it in their eyes. The doubt, the uncertainty. It was as if they were trying to figure out where she belonged in their world, and they never quite saw her as a fit. And then there were the comments that cut deepest. "You're talented, but this industry isn't ready for someone like you. You need to work harder if you want to be taken seriously. Maybe if you looked a bit more marketable." The sting of rejection had become an old friend, familiar and cruel. There were nights when Tasha sat alone in her tiny apartment, staring out the window at the darkened skyline, wondering if all her hard work was for nothing. Could she ever break through? Could she ever be more than just the black singer with a dream? But every time that doubt crept in, there was one thing that kept her going, her mother's voice echoing in her mind. Don't stop, Tasha. You were born to do this. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. That's what had driven her here. That's why when Derek Moretti mocked her on that stage, she couldn't back down. She had something to prove, not just to him, but to herself. She wasn't some hopeful dreamer. She wasn't just another black woman trying to fight for a seat at the table. She was a force, one that had fought for every inch of her place in this world. As the music industry continued to overlook her, Tasha began to build her own platform. She sang wherever she could, on street corners, in bars, at local community events. She connected with people, built relationships with those who saw her for what she was, an artist, not just a woman of color with a dream. Slowly but surely, people started to listen. Her voice was her weapon, and she used it to carve a space where she could thrive. Yet even with all her progress, there were still moments of doubt. Would it ever be enough? Would she ever be able to step out of the shadows of people like Derek Moretti, who saw her as nothing more than an afterthought? The path was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. Tasha wasn't giving up. Not now, not ever. The room was alive with chatter and laughter, but all Tasha could hear was the thundering beat of her heart in her chest. Derek Moretti's mocking words still echoed in her mind as she stood backstage, staring at the curtain. Every fiber in her being screamed to turn and run, but she couldn't. Not now, not after everything she had fought for. The spotlight was blinding as the curtain pulled back, and for a moment she couldn't see the audience. She only heard them, the whispers, the glances, the businessmen, the executives, the elite, and Derek. He sat comfortably at the front, a smug grin on his face, clearly convinced she wouldn't last 5 minutes. "You've got this," her manager whispered, squeezing her shoulder. Tasha stepped forward, gripping the microphone, trying to steady her shaking hands. As the first note filled the air, she saw Derek's face briefly. He leaned back, bored, his arms crossed. His smirk said it all. He didn't believe in her, but Tasha wasn't here for him. She wasn't here for anyone but herself. And with every note she sang, she poured everything into it. Her heart, her pain, her years of fighting to be seen. The crowd fell silent. She could feel them shifting, leaning in, feeling the power of her voice. Derek, still convinced it was just a show, barely blinked. But the moment the last note hit, his eyes snapped open, and for the first time, he wasn't looking at her as the underdog. He was looking at her as someone who just might change everything. As Tasha's voice filled the room, the atmosphere shifted. What began as polite attention turned into something deeper, more magnetic. Each note she sang seemed to reverberate through the crowd, pulling them in, breaking down the walls of doubt. The melody wrapped around them, weaving a spell they couldn't resist. Derek sat back, his arms still crossed, his confidence unwavering. Until the first few notes hit, his eyes narrowed. There was something about her voice, something raw and powerful. It didn't match the stereotype he had built for her in his mind. It wasn't what he expected from a young woman like her. As the song soared, so did Tasha's confidence. The crowd was no longer just listening. They were hanging on every word, every phrase. Derek's posture shifted, his smirk faltering. His jaw tightened as he tried to make sense of what was happening. He couldn't reconcile this woman with the one he had mocked just moments before. The energy in the room surged. Tasha's transformation was undeniable, and so was the reaction from the audience. They weren't just impressed, they were mesmerized. Derek, once so sure of his superiority, was now forced to reckon with the truth. He had underestimated her. He could no longer dismiss her talent, no longer ignore the undeniable power she held in her voice. The applause was deafening. Tasha stood on stage, still catching her breath, as the crowd erupted into praise. But amidst the cheers, a bitter-sweet feeling settled in her chest. She had proven them wrong, but the validation felt hollow. Why had it taken so long? Why did her talent have to be questioned in the first place? As she stepped off the stage, her manager was already there, beaming with pride. "You did it, Tasha! You showed them!" But Tasha couldn't shake the nagging thought. Why did it have to be like this? She had worked her whole life to earn this moment, and now it was a reminder of the battles she'd fought just to be seen. Her talent was always there. Why did it take so long for anyone to notice? Across the room, Derek Moretti sat quietly, no longer exuding the arrogance he once did. He watched Tasha, still processing what had just happened. His earlier mockery was now a stark reminder of how deeply he had misjudged her. The singer he had dismissed, assuming she wasn't worth his time, had just commanded the stage in a way he couldn't ignore. For the first time, Derek reflected on his assumptions, his prejudice. The power in Tasha's voice, the confidence in her performance, it shattered everything he thought he knew about her, and about himself. The room had quieted, but Tasha's heart was still racing. She had proven her worth, but something still lingered, the sting of Derek's earlier mockery. As she made her way through the crowd, she spotted him at the bar, still trying to play it cool, his arrogance a mere shadow of what it had been. Without a second thought, Tasha walked up to him. The people around them barely noticed as she stood in front of him, her eyes steady and unwavering. "You thought I wouldn't make it," Tasha said, her voice calm but cutting. "You thought you could dismiss me because of who I am, because of what you assumed about me?" Derek looked up, his face a mask of discomfort. He opened his mouth to say something, but she stopped him. "You don't know me. You didn't know my journey. You didn't know the years of rejection, the doors that were slammed in my face, the people who told me I wasn't enough. But I never gave up, and I never will." Derek's expression faltered. He opened his mouth again, this time as if searching for words but found none. For the first time that night, the businessman was speechless. The walls of his superiority began to crumble as he realized the depth of his mistake. Tasha stood tall, no longer the timid woman trying to fit in. Next time, don't judge someone before you know their story. The following weeks were a whirlwind for Tasha. News of her unforgettable performance spread like wildfire. Industry doors that had once been closed began to open, and offers flooded in. She was no longer just a hopeful dreamer. She was an artist, a force to be reckoned with. As for Derek, he had changed. The arrogant businessman who once believed power and privilege defined a person's worth was now questioning everything. He had witnessed firsthand the consequences of his own prejudice and arrogance. Though he never openly admitted it, there was a quiet humility in his demeanor the next time their paths crossed. Derek had learned that true value wasn't determined by wealth, status, or assumptions, but by the depth of a person's heart and the strength of their spirit. Tasha's journey was far from over. Every performance, every challenge, every victory, she embraced them all. But the lesson she carried with her, the one that resonated most, was clear. No one had the right to define her worth. Only she did. And as she stood on that stage once again, the crowd cheering her name, she knew this was just the beginning. She had proven that nothing, not even prejudice, could silence her voice. No matter where you come from, who you are, or how others perceive you, your worth is not defined by anyone but yourself. Believe in your journey, stand against prejudice, and never let anyone silence your voice. Have you ever been judged based on your background or appearance? Share your story in the comments. And if you believe in equality and standing up for what's right, hit that like button.